7 consecutive losses, 0 victories since the Olympic break. And the most dangerous 4 words in professional hockey are now being whispered openly across the league. Toronto is giving up. Not giving up in a dramatic, roster-blowing, white flag-waving sense that a full rebuild would require. Giving up in the far more insidious way that defines franchises caught between 2 realities, unable to commit to either direction with conviction that meaningful outcomes demand. The Maple Leafs in 2026 are not a team in transition. They are a team in freefall. And what makes this particular descent so analytically fascinating and so organizationally damning is that the ground rushing upward was always visible. The warning signs were never hidden. The structural vulnerabilities were identified, discussed, and ultimately ignored in favor of the same cosmetic solutions that have defined this franchise's approach to its own limitations for the better part of a decade. Toronto Maple Leafs losing streak 2026 standings. Let's begin with the Rangers episode, because it tells you everything you need to understand about how the rest of the league currently perceives Toronto's organizational positioning. Chris Drury operated with the calculated aggression of a general manager who recognizes a desperate counterpart when he sees one. Reportedly presented Brad Treliving with a proposal built on the assumption that Toronto's crisis had overwhelmed its judgment. The ask was extraordinary in its ambition. Fraser Minten, the franchise's most credible and most promising prospect, combined with first-round selection in exchange for Vincent Trocheck, a veteran center on the wrong side of his competitive prime, on a contract that represents a significant financial commitment for a player whose best days are demonstrably behind him. The Rangers' proposal was not a genuine offer competitive partnership. It was a predatory assessment of how far Toronto's desperation had degraded its negotiating position. Fraser Minten, Toronto Maple Leafs prospect 2026. That Treliving refused is the correct decision. It may be the only clearly correct decision this front office has made across the entire arc of this deadline period. But the fact that the conversation happened at all, that Drury felt confident enough in Toronto's vulnerability to present an offer that egregious, speaks volumes about the signal this franchise is currently broadcasting to every general manager across the league. When your peers believe they can approach you with a proposal that amounts to trading your future foundation for a declining veteran and expect serious consideration, you have already lost something more important than 7 hockey games. You have lost the organizational credibility that protects franchises from being systematically exploited during their weakest moments. The Minten dimension of this story deserves specific attention because it sits at the intersection of every major question facing Toronto's competitive future. Minten is not merely a prospect in conventional sense, a theoretical asset whose value exists primarily on a development timeline that remains years from competitive relevance. He represents something considerably more specific and considerably more urgent for this organization. In a franchise environment where the current core ceiling has been tested repeatedly in playoff conditions and found insufficient, Minten is the most tangible evidence that a competitive future beyond the Matthews era is possible. Trading him for Trocheck would not have been a deadline move. It would have been an organizational surrender. The moment when Toronto formally acknowledged that it was willing to cannibalize its future to generate the illusion of present-tense competitiveness for a roster that has already demonstrated its limitations. NHL prospect value franchise cornerstone development. But here is where the analysis must move beyond the Rangers transaction and into the territory that genuinely defines the stakes of this moment for the Maple Leafs. The 7-game losing streak is not merely a competitive problem. It is a draft lottery problem. And the draft lottery problem has a specific and deeply uncomfortable dimension that involves the franchise Toronto considers its most historically significant rival. The Boston Bruins are watching this collapse with the particular interest of an organization that stands to benefit directly from Toronto's misfortune. The protected pick structure that exists within the current roster architecture means that a Toronto draft selection, the precise value of which depends on where the Maple Leafs finish in the final standings, could be headed to Boston as part of a previous transaction's completion. Every additional loss Toronto accumulates in this losing streak is not simply a point removed from the playoff race. It is a potential improvement in the draft position of a pick that the Bruins may collect. The Maple Leafs are not just losing hockey games. They are potentially losing them on behalf of the one franchise that their fan base most viscerally does not want to see benefit from Toronto's dysfunction. Boston Bruins draft lottery picked Toronto Maple Leafs 2026. John Cooper's diplomatic characterization of this stretch as merely a competitive stumble reflects the measured language of a coach navigating a politically sensitive moment. But the data underneath that language tells a considerably harsher story. 7 consecutive losses in the NHL regular season, particularly in a competitive conference where the playoff margin is compressed, represents a structural collapse rather than a temporary variance in results. Teams that lose 7 straight are not experiencing bad luck distributed across otherwise competitive performances. They are experiencing a systematic failure of the competitive identity that sustained them through the earlier portions of a season, and the timing of this collapse, following the Olympic break, in the final stretch of the regular season, with the deadline window creating organizational uncertainty throughout the roster, suggests that the psychological dimensions of this failure run considerably deeper than a correctable tactical problem. The Olympic break itself deserves examination as a contributing factor to what has unfolded since Toronto returned to competition. There is a well-documented pattern in NHL history where teams carrying significant internal tension, roster uncertainty, locker room questions about organizational direction, players aware they may be traded, struggle disproportionately during and after breaks that interrupt the competitive rhythm that masks those tensions during the grind of regular season. The break provided no competitive shelter for Toronto. It provided time for players to think, time for uncertainty to crystallize, time for the organizational signals transmitted to the McMahon and Lawton and Ekman-Larsson situations to be fully processed in the absence of the distraction that daily competition provides. The team that returned from the Olympics was not refreshed. It was fractured by the weight of everything the break had allowed to settle. NHL Olympic break team performance impact historical data. The 4-star problem at the core of Toronto's competitive identity is the framework that makes everything else in this analysis comprehensible. This franchise has organized its competitive philosophy, its financial commitments, and its roster construction strategy around the assumption that extraordinary individual talent concentrated at the top of the lineup is sufficient to overcome structural deficiencies elsewhere on the roster. That assumption has been tested in playoff conditions repeatedly. It has failed repeatedly. And yet the organizational response to each failure has been to double down on the assumption rather than challenge it, to add another high-end offensive piece, to protect the existing maximum contracts, and to treat the players who might address the structural deficiencies as the expendable components in the next round of roster maneuvering. The 7-game losing streak is the regular season delivering the same verdict that the playoffs have delivered year after year. Elite offensive talent, unprotected by physical depth, unsupported by genuine defensive structure, and operated within an organizational culture that has lost the trust of its own roster through a series of decisions that prioritize financial optics over competitive integrity, does not consistently win hockey games at the level required to matter. The regular season has always been forgiving enough to obscure this reality long enough to generate playoff qualification. The playoff bracket has never been forgiving enough to allow it to hide. NHL regular season versus playoff performance gap elite teams. The draft lottery calculation that now looms over the remainder of Toronto's season represents the cruelest possible irony for a franchise that has spent this entire deadline period liquidating assets in the name of accumulating future capital. The picks being gathered through McMahon and Lawton and Ekman-Larsson transactions were supposed to represent a responsible investment in the franchise's competitive future. But if the losing streak continues, if the standings position deteriorates to a level that meaningfully improves the draft lottery odds attached to the pick heading toward Boston, then the assets being accumulated through roster liquidation are being generated at the direct cost of strengthening the rival who may receive the most consequential pick Toronto possesses. The franchise would simultaneously be selling its present and gifting its future, a combinatorial disaster of organizational decision-making that could define the Maple Leafs' competitive trajectory for years. NHL Draft Lottery Odds 2026 Eastern Conference. Treliving's refusal of the Trocheck Minten proposal was correct, but correctness in isolation does not constitute a strategy. The question this front office must now answer: with genuine honesty rather than the defensive posturing that characterizes most of its public communications, is whether there exists a coherent vision for what this franchise becomes on the other side of this crisis. Not a deadline vision, not a press conference vision, a real, structurally grounded competitive vision that acknowledges what the current core has and is not demonstrated over years of playoff competition, that protects the assets representing the franchise's genuine future without sacrificing the paper over the failures of the present, and that builds toward a competitive identity capable of sustaining success rather than manufacturing the appearance of it. The ice in Toronto has never been thinner. Every loss makes it thinner still. And somewhere in Boston, the Bruins are watching cracks spread with the patient satisfaction of an organization that understands, perhaps better than any other, exactly what it looks like when a rival's foundation gives way. The question is whether Toronto collapses through or finds a disciplined step back from the edge before the damage becomes genuinely irreversible. Sound off below, because this franchise is at the kind of crossroads that fans remember for generations, and the direction it chooses from here will define what the Maple Leafs mean to the city for years to come.